In the blazing summer of 1212, the heart of Iberia trembled. The mountains of Andalusia echoed with the sound of hooves, steel, and prayer. For nearly 5 centuries, the banner of Islam had flown over Spain, carried by scholars, warriors, and poets who turned Al-Andalus into one of the brightest jewels of medieval civilization. But by the dawn of the 13th century, that world stood on the edge of ruin. The forces of Christendom had united, driven by a single purpose: to reclaim the lands they once called theirs and to erase the last great Muslim power in Europe. This is the story of how Spain turned upon its former conquerors, of how one decisive battle shattered centuries of Muslim rule, the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa. To understand how the battlefield came to decide the fate of an entire civilization, we must first look at the Spain that was a land divided, restless, and soaked in the blood of empires. When the Moors first crossed the straits in 711 under Tariq ibn Ziyad, they came as conquerors and visionaries. In a matter of years, most of the Iberian Peninsula fell under their control, and Al-Andalus blossomed into a beacon of knowledge, tolerance, and art. Cities like Córdoba, Seville, and Granada shone brighter than any in Europe, with libraries holding hundreds of thousands of volumes, while Christian kingdoms in the north still struggled in darkness. But empires age like men, glorious in youth, fragile in decline. By the 12th century, internal rivalries and the rise of fanatic dynasties from North Africa had begun to fracture Al-Andalus from within. The Almoravids had come first, austere warriors from the deserts of Morocco, claiming to purify Islam and protect it from the encroaching Christians. They had succeeded for a time. Then came the Almohads, even stricter, even more ruthless, led by the self-proclaimed Mahdi ibn Tumart, whose doctrine saw the world as a war between true believers and heretics. They crushed the remnants of the Almoravids and took control of both North Africa and Al-Andalus. For decades, their empire had stood as a wall against the Christian advance, but by 1212, that wall was crumbling. In the north, the Christian kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, and Navarre had grown bold and ambitious. Their rulers, Alfonso VIII of Castile, Pedro II of Aragon, and Sancho VII of Navarre, had long fought each other as bitter rivals. Yet the Almohad threat forced an uneasy alliance among them. The Pope in Rome had declared it a crusade, promising salvation to all who joined. Priests preached from pulpits that this was not just a war for land. It was a war for God, for Christendom itself. Pilgrims, knights, and peasants flooded south, answering the call to holy war. For the first time in centuries, Spain stood united, not in peace, but in purpose. Meanwhile, in the south, the Almohad Caliph Muhammad al-Nasir, known in Christian chronicles as Miramamolin, assembled one of the largest armies the Iberian Peninsula had ever seen. From Marrakesh to Seville, from the Atlas Mountains to the Guadalquivir, the call to jihad rang out. The Caliph saw himself as the heir of Tariq and the avenger of Al-Andalus. His banners, inscribed with Quranic verses, were said to stretch as far as the eye could see. Contemporary accounts claimed he commanded more than 200,000 men. Berber infantry, black African guards, and mounted warriors from every corner of the Maghreb. At their head rode the Caliph himself, draped in white, confident that divine justice was on his side. When word of the approaching Muslim host reached the Christian courts, panic swept through the ranks. Memories of earlier defeats, of Christian armies annihilated in the south, still haunted them. Alfonso VIII, a man haunted by failure, had once suffered a catastrophic loss at Alarcos in 1195, where the Almohads crushed his forces and left thousands dead. That humiliation had festered for years, burning like a wound he could never heal. Now, with this new crusade, he sought redemption, not just for himself, but for the entire Christian world. The crusading army gathered in Toledo, a city that had once been the heart of Islamic Spain and now stood as a symbol of Christian resurgence. Tens of thousands camped outside its ancient walls. French crusaders under the Cross of Burgundy, knights from Castile and Aragon, soldiers from Leon and Navarre. It was a sight unseen in centuries. The armies of Europe united under one banner, chanting hymns and sharpening their blades. Yet unity was fragile. The French crusaders, arrogant and undisciplined, looked down upon their Spanish allies, mocking their customs and scorning their leadership. Tensions simmered until a papal legate intervened, reminding them that their true enemy lay in the south. By early summer, the Crusader host began its march toward Andalusia. The journey was brutal. Under the scorching Spanish sun, men and horses fell from exhaustion. Supply lines faltered and morale wavered. Rumors spread that al-Nasir's army was larger than anything they could face. But Alfonso pressed on, knowing that retreat would mean the death of everything they had built. By mid-July, the two armies finally drew near, separated only by the rugged passes of the Sierra Morena, the mountains that marked the gateway to the south. It was here that fate played its hand. The Almohads had taken position in a valley near the town of Las Navas de Tolosa, their camp fortified and seemingly unassailable. Scouts brought back grim reports. Narrow mountain paths blocked by Muslim troops, traps laid in the ravines, and watchtowers guarding every approach. To attack head-on would be suicide, yet to hesitate would doom the crusade. The Christian commanders convened in secret council. Many urged retreat, but Alfonso refused. He had waited too long for this moment. As despair settled over the camp, a miracle, or what they saw as one, occurred. A local shepherd, familiar with the mountains, offered to lead them through a hidden path, a forgotten route through the hills that bypassed the Almohad defenses. Alfonso seized the chance. Through the night, in eerie silence, the Christian army began its perilous climb. By dawn, they emerged on the heights overlooking the Muslim camp. Below them stretched the might of the Almohad Empire, tents glinting white in the sun, banners fluttering in the dry Andalusian wind. The caliph's pavilion stood at the center, surrounded by concentric rings of guards and chains, a symbolic wall of faith and power. What happened next would determine not just the fate of Al-Andalus, but the very soul of Spain. The dawn of July 16th, 1212, broke hot and merciless over the plains of Andalusia. The Christian army, still covered in the dust of its midnight crossing, now stood face to face with the full might of the Almohad Caliphate. The valley below them shimmered with heat and steel, an ocean of men arrayed beneath the green banners of Islam. At its center stood the caliph's great encampment, ringed with gold-embroidered tents and guarded by the black-clad slave soldiers, known as the Guard of the Chain. They were the elite, bound together not just by oath, but literally by iron chains, a symbolic gesture to show they would never retreat. Behind them rose the caliph's standard, a vast white banner said to bear the sacred words of the Quran. It was more than an army. It was the embodiment of an empire's pride. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, across the valley, the sound of horns erupted, a deep, guttural roar that rolled through the mountains. The Almohad lines began to move, their banners advancing like waves of green flame. Drums thundered. The Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa had begun. The Christians descended from the high ground, their banners rippling in the wind. The Cross of Castile, the Lion of Leon, the chains of Navarre, and the stripes of Aragon. Alfonso VIII rode at the center, his armor gleaming, his eyes fixed on the horizon. To his right, King Pedro of Aragon marshaled his knights, their horses snorting and pawing the earth. To the left, Sancho of Navarre's men, fierce mountain warriors hardened by decades of border war. Behind them, Crusaders from France, Burgundy, and beyond lowered their lances, praying under their breath. The first collision was thunder itself. Almohad cavalry, fast and fanatical, charged up the slope to scatter the Christian front. The impact shattered men and horses alike. Spears broke, shields splintered, and the air filled with dust and screams. For hours, the two lines surged back and forth like a tide of blood. The Christians fought in tight formations, their infantry bracing behind walls of shields as Muslim archers rained arrows upon them. Above the chaos, Alfonso's voice could be heard shouting commands, urging his men to hold. But the Almohads were relentless. Waves of Berber warriors hurled themselves forward, shouting Allahu Akbar as they crashed into the Crusader ranks. Under the blazing sun, the battlefield became a cauldron. The Christian vanguard began to waver. French knights, exhausted and scorched, started to fall back. Alfonso saw it, the moment of collapse, and made his choice. He rode directly into the storm. The chroniclers say he carried the royal banner himself, rallying his men with cries of vengeance for Alarcos, vengeance for the lost generations. His courage ignited the line. Reinforcements surged forward. On the right flank, Pedro of Aragon led a devastating countercharge, cutting through the Berber cavalry and driving them back toward the valley floor. Then, amid the chaos, a signal was given. The reserve, the hardened Knights of Navarre, charged straight for the center. Sancho VII, known as Sancho the Strong, was a giant of a man, towering over friend and foe alike. He led his knights directly into the heart of the Almohad formation. Their lances struck like thunderbolts, breaking through the first ranks, then the second. The battle had turned from chaos into fury. The Caliph's guards, the chained warriors, stood their ground, hundreds of them bound together, refusing to yield even as the Navarre's charge slammed into them. The clash was apocalyptic, steel against flesh, faith against fury. The Christians hacked and tore, their horses trampling men into the dust. The chains that had once symbolized loyalty now became their prison. One by one, the guards fell where they stood, dragging their comrades down with them. Through the smoke and the screaming, Sancho's men broke through the final ring of chains and burst into the Caliph's camp. There, beneath the silken pavilion of Muhammad al-Nasir, the battle reached its bloody climax. The Caliph's personal bodyguard fought to the last man, but the tide was unstoppable. The white banner of the Almohads fell, trampled beneath hooves and dust. The Caliph himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing south toward Jaén, abandoning his army to ruin. By mid-afternoon, the battlefield was unrecognizable. What had begun as a disciplined confrontation had devolved into slaughter. The Almohad army, once proud and unyielding, dissolved in panic. Men threw down their weapons and fled toward the south, pursued relentlessly by Christian cavalry. The heat turned the valley into a furnace, and the stench of blood and death filled the air. When the sun finally began to set, the plain of Las Navas was carpeted with the fallen. Tens of thousands lay dead. Berbers, Arabs, Africans, and Spaniards alike. The once mighty army of al-Nasir had ceased to exist. Alfonso VIII stood atop a hill overlooking the carnage, his armor dented and streaked with dust. He had avenged his defeat at Alarcos. He had delivered the victory of a lifetime. And yet, as his men sang hymns of triumph, the king remained silent. He knew what this day meant, not just for him, but for the entire world. The Muslim power in Spain had been broken. The news spread like wildfire. From Toledo to Rome, from Paris to London, church bells rang out in celebration. Chroniclers called it a miracle, a divine judgment against the infidel. Pilgrims wept in the streets. The Pope himself declared it proof of God's favor. But in the south, in the great cities of Al-Andalus, grief took root. For the Muslims of Spain, Las Navas de Tolosa was not just a defeat. It was the beginning of the end. The Almohad Empire, already straining under the weight of rebellion and distance, began to disintegrate. Provinces broke away. Governors declared independence. In less than a generation, the empire that had once ruled from Marrakesh to Cordoba was gone, and with its fall, the balance of power in Iberia shifted forever. The Christian kings pressed their advantage. Castile captured the great strongholds of Baeza and Ubeda. The frontier moved south, closer to the rich heartlands of Granada and Seville. For the first time in centuries, the dream of a united Christian Spain seemed within reach. Yet beneath the banners of triumph, something darker stirred, a sense that this was more than a victory of armies. It was the death of a civilization. The libraries of Cordoba, once filled with the wisdom of Aristotle and Averroes, would soon fall silent. The poets, the scientists, the philosophers who had defined the brilliance of Al-Andalus would scatter into exile. The Spain that emerged from Las Navas was a harder land, proud, devout, and unyielding. The age of coexistence was ending, replaced by centuries of conquest and expulsion. The chain that had once guarded the caliph's tent, the same that Sancho's knights had torn apart, was taken north as a trophy. It still hangs today in the Cathedral of Navarre, a symbol of the moment Europe turned the tide. The smoke from Las Navas de Tolosa lingered over the hills for days, a dark haze marking the spot where an empire had broken. Crows circled over the battlefield, feeding on the dead. The victory was total, but it was not clean. Whole villages would remember the smell of the summer wind that carried the stench of death from the valley. Alfonso's army, exhausted and blood-stained, moved south through lands that had been Muslim for centuries. Each fortress they passed bore silent witness to what had been lost. The walls of Al-Andalus, once defended by armies of scholars and sultans, now stood cracked and trembling. Muhammad al-Nasir's flight to Morocco marked the beginning of the end for Almohad rule in Spain. Within months, rebellions broke out across the empire. The governors of Cordoba, Seville, and Granada, seeing weakness in the caliph's court, began asserting independence. The chain that had once linked North Africa and Iberia snapped. The Almohad Empire fractured into fragments, and those fragments fell one by one. When al-Nasir died in 1213, his successors inherited not an empire, but a ghost of one. The Christian kingdoms wasted no time. Alfonso VIII, hailed as the savior of Christendom, returned to Toledo in triumph. Bells rang for days. Chroniclers compared him to Charlemagne. His army carried home the spoils of centuries, gold, silk, and sacred relics. But the greatest prize was psychological. For generations, the Muslim power in Iberia had been seen as invincible. That myth was gone forever. Europe, for the first time since 711, looked south not with fear, but with hunger. And the Reconquista, once a slow, uncertain push, now became a crusade without pause. In the years that followed, cities that had stood under the crescent for half a millennium began to fall. Baeza surrendered in 1227. Cordoba, the crown jewel of Al-Andalus, was captured by Ferdinand III in 1236. Its great mosque, one of the wonders of the world, was consecrated as a cathedral. The Christian rulers called it divine justice. To the people who had lived there for generations, it was the end of everything they had known. Families who could trace their ancestry back to the first Arab conquerors were forced to flee south or convert. For the first time, the dream of coexistence, the convivencia that had allowed Muslims, Christians, and Jews to live under one sky, began to die. As the Christian frontier moved further south, the map of Spain changed color. What had once been a mosaic of cultures slowly hardened into a single vision. The crusading spirit that had burned at Las Navas became the defining force of Spanish identity. The kings of Castile and Aragon saw themselves not only as monarchs, but as instruments of divine will. With every city they conquered, churches replaced mosques, crosses rose over minarets, and the Arabic call to prayer faded into silence. The last great refuge of Muslim Spain was Granada. Protected by the snow-capped peaks of the Sierra Nevada and fortified by walls that had withstood centuries of war, it became the final bastion of Al-Andalus. There, the Nasrid dynasty carved out a fragile kingdom, balancing diplomacy with tribute. For 2.5 centuries, Granada survived, its poets writing verses about beauty and loss, its sultans paying gold to Christian kings for the right to exist. But the shadow of Las Navas hung over them all. It was a reminder that no matter how rich or cultured they were, their time was running out. In the Christian north, new powers rose. The union of Castile and Aragon through the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella created a kingdom unlike any before it. They inherited the legacy of centuries of crusade, the belief that Spain's destiny was holy and its mission unfinished. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453 had shocked Europe, but it also reignited old fears of Islamic resurgence. For Ferdinand and Isabella, the unfinished business was clear. Granada was the last thread left to be cut. By the late 15th century, the Reconquista had become not just a war, but an ideology. Chroniclers compared it to the Crusades of the Holy Land, framing Spain's struggle as the front line between light and darkness. The armies that marched south under the royal banner of Castile were no longer fighting for territory, they were fighting for God. Priests blessed cannons, monks carried relics into battle, and royal proclamations promised forgiveness of sins to anyone who took part. Granada's days were numbered. When the siege finally began in 1491, it was less a battle and more a slow suffocation. The Christian forces encircled the city, cutting off food and trade. Inside, famine and despair spread. The last Nasrid ruler, Muhammad XII, known to the Christians as Boabdil, faced an impossible choice. His advisors urged defiance, but he knew the truth. Granada could not withstand another generation of war. On January 2nd, 1492, the city surrendered. The keys of the Alhambra, the great red fortress of the Nasrids, were handed to Ferdinand and Isabella. As the royal banners rose over its towers, Spain was finally united under the cross. The Reconquista was complete. Boabdil stood on a hill overlooking his lost city, tears streaming down his face. His mother's words have echoed through the centuries. Weep like a woman for what you could not defend as a man. That moment marked more than just the end of Muslim rule in Spain. It was the end of an era, a 1,000-year chapter of civilization closing in silence. Granada's mosques became churches. Its libraries were burned. The scholars who had once debated philosophy and medicine under starlit courtyards were gone. Within a few years, the Catholic monarchs issued the Edict of Expulsion, ordering every practicing Muslim and Jew to convert or leave. Spain, reborn in faith, was also reborn in fire. From Cordoba's shattered libraries to Granada's silent courtyards, the ghosts of Al-Andalus lingered. Its art, its architecture, and its science left deep roots in the land. Even as the Inquisition sought to erase its memory, it lived on in the arches of cathedrals, in the words of the Spanish language, and in the irrigation canals that still traced the hillsides. Las Navas de Tolosa had not just been a military victory. It had been the spark of a transformation that would reshape Europe. What began as a single battle became a centuries-long crusade, one that ended not in conquest, but in cultural rebirth built upon ashes. For the Muslims who once called Iberia home, exile was a second death. Some fled to North Africa, carrying with them the memories of lost palaces and the songs of poets who would never return. Others stayed behind, hiding their faith in secret. They prayed in whispers, their children baptized in names they did not believe in. History would remember them as the Moriscos, converts in name, strangers in their own land. Spain's triumph at Las Navas de Tolosa had redrawn the map of Europe. It ended one empire and gave rise to another. The same spirit that drove knights through the passes of the Sierra Morena would, centuries later, carry Spanish ships across oceans. The Reconquista had turned inward faith into outward ambition. Within 50 years of Granada's fall, Spanish explorers would reach the New World. The same cross that replaced the crescent over Andalusia would soon be raised in lands unknown to any before them. The tide of history, once flowing south, now flowed west. The Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa was more than a victory. It was a hinge in time. It marked the death of medieval Islam in Europe and the birth of modern Spain. And though centuries have passed, its echo still shapes the world. What began with swords and banners ended with empires and voyages. It was not only a clash of armies, but of identities, beliefs, and destinies. One world ended on that battlefield, and another began. The centuries after Las Navas de Tolosa reshaped the destiny of Spain and the wider world. The victory had broken the psychological barrier that had long restrained Christendom. For the first time since the Moors had crossed from Africa, Spain's kings could look upon the land and see no equal power to challenge them. What followed was not just conquest. It was purification, a remolding of an entire society in the image of a single faith. The church and crown worked hand in hand to forge unity through devotion, and devotion through fear. The momentum of the Reconquista carried beyond the battlefield. As Christian armies absorbed Muslim cities, entire populations were displaced. The old balance of coexistence, the slow, uneasy peace that had allowed Christians, Muslims, and Jews to share one land, was gone. Conversion was the new currency of survival. Across Andalusia, families who had prayed in Arabic for generations now whispered their faith in secret. Their mosques became churches overnight. Imams were made to kneel before altars and kiss crucifixes in ceremonies meant to erase the memory of who they were. But the erasure of Al-Andalus was not only spiritual, it was physical. Libraries that had once drawn scholars from across the Mediterranean were emptied, their manuscripts burned in public squares under the watchful eyes of priests. Artisans who had adorned the walls of Granada and Seville with intricate calligraphy found themselves forced to carve Christian symbols into their own designs. The land itself seemed to mourn. Rivers that had once irrigated fields of olives and oranges now ran beside churches built from the stones of demolished mosques. Granada became a symbol of this transformation, a city haunted by both glory and loss. The Alhambra, the last fortress of Muslim kings, was spared from destruction, but it was stripped of its meaning. Its marble halls, once filled with poetry and prayer, echoed only with the footsteps of new rulers who saw beauty as conquest. The palace stood as both a trophy and a tomb, its walls whispering verses of a world that had vanished. For the Spanish crown, unity demanded control. The monarchs believed that only through absolute religious conformity could the nation remain strong. Thus, in 1478, the Inquisition was born. Its goal was to root out heresy, but in practice, it became an instrument of terror. Muslims who had converted to Christianity, the Moriscos, were watched, questioned, and tortured. Accusations spread like wildfire. Whispers of secret prayers, of families turning their faces toward Mecca under cover of night. Those found guilty were paraded through the streets in public trials, known as autos da fe, where faith itself was put on display in a theater of flames. The expulsion came next. In 1502, every Muslim in Castile and Leon was given a choice: conversion or exile. Those in Aragon followed a century later. Entire communities packed what little they could carry and fled across the Mediterranean, back to lands their ancestors had left 800 years before. The journey was cruel. Many died at sea, their boats overturned by storms or pirates. Others were sold into slavery upon reaching Africa, unwelcome even among their kin. Those who stayed in Spain became invisible, blending into the fabric of a society that would never fully accept them. Yet even as Spain sought to purge its past, that same past fueled its rise. The wealth seized from Muslim lands financed cathedrals, armies, and ships. The discipline forged in centuries of holy war produced soldiers hardened for conquest. By the dawn of the 16th century, Spain had turned its gaze outward. The fall of Granada coincided almost perfectly with Columbus setting sail across the Atlantic, carrying Spain's banners to the edges of the known world. The same zeal that had driven knights against the walls of Moorish fortresses now propelled explorers through storms and darkness in search of new empires. The world that emerged from this crucible was complex and contradictory. Spain stood as the most powerful kingdom in Europe, united, devout, and relentless. But beneath the surface, the wounds of its history still bled. The descendants of Muslims and Jews who had converted under duress lived with suspicion as neighbors, never fully trusted. Towns that had once echoed with multiple languages now spoke only one. The richness of diversity that had defined Al-Andalus was gone, replaced by uniformity and fear. Still, memory endures where history tries to forget. The arches of Cordoba, the gardens of the Alhambra, and the verses of Andalusian poets survived the centuries, quiet reminders that Spain's strength had once been born of mixture, not separation. Scholars in later generations would rediscover the manuscripts saved from the flames, realizing that the same culture Spain had destroyed had also laid the foundations for its own enlightenment. Algebra, medicine, astronomy, all the knowledge Europe would one day claim as its own had flowed first through the hands of Muslim Spain. In many ways, Las Navas de Tolosa was both an ending and a beginning. It ended the era of Muslim rule in Europe, yes, but it also began a new chapter of empire, exploration, and faith that would define the next 500 years. The battlefield where chained guards died defending their caliph's tent was the same ground where the modern world began to shift. From those ashes rose both triumph and tragedy, the story of a nation that gained the world but lost part of its soul. Today, the echoes of that battle still linger in Spain's identity. The architecture, the language, even the music carry traces of Al-Andalus. Every archway, every courtyard, every whisper of the oud or guitar tells a story older than conquest. The history of Spain is not a simple tale of victory and defeat. It is a mosaic of blood and brilliance, faith and fire. The Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa was not just a turning point in war. It was a transformation of civilization. It set in motion the fall of an empire, the rise of another, and the forging of a nation that would shape the destiny of continents. What began as a clash of swords in a dusty Andalusian valley became the spark that lit the age of empire. The memory of Las Navas de Tolosa has never truly faded. Over the centuries, chroniclers, poets, and kings have reimagined that battle as the moment Spain found itself. A divine victory ordained by heaven, the triumph of cross over crescent. But behind the legend lies something more complicated, a story not just of conquest, but of transformation. The valley of Las Navas was soaked in the blood of two civilizations, and out of that blood, a new world was born. It was a turning point that redrew the map of faith and power, not only in Spain, but across the world. After the fall of Granada in 1492, Spain stood tall as a united Christian kingdom for the first time in history. Ferdinand and Isabella saw themselves as chosen by God to complete what Las Navas had begun. They were not just monarchs, they were symbols of divine order restored. But unity came at a cost. The Spain that emerged was fierce, devout, and ambitious, but it was also intolerant and rigid, forged in centuries of holy war. It had learned to define itself by what it was not. To be Spanish was to be Christian. Anything else was suspect. The Inquisition intensified, expanding its reach from the south of Spain into every province. It became not only a tribunal of faith, but a weapon of control. It targeted not just hidden Muslims and Jews, but even old Christian families accused of sympathy with them. So fear became a language everyone understood. Confessions were drawn by fire, loyalty measured in tears. Those who refused to renounce their past vanished into prisons that few left alive. The same fervor that had once driven knights to charge across the Sierra Morena now turned inward, consuming its own people. For the Moriscos, the Muslims who had converted under pressure, the 16th century became a nightmare. They tilled their fields, paid their taxes, attended mass, but were never trusted. The church watched their every move. Villages where Arabic was once spoken openly now whispered it in secret. Families passed down prayers as coded songs. Even food became an act of rebellion. The Inquisition banned dishes like couscous, fearing they carried traces of Islam. Centuries after Las Navas, the war had not truly ended. It had simply changed its form. Then, in 1609, came the final blow. King Philip III decreed the expulsion of all remaining Moriscos from Spain. It was a decision cloaked in righteousness, but rooted in fear and greed. The decree shattered communities overnight. Nearly 500,000 people were forced from their homes, driven to the coasts under armed guard. Mothers carried infants, old men stumbled beside carts laden with what little they could salvage. Along the roads, priests offered last-minute baptisms, hoping to save souls as bodies collapsed from exhaustion. The ports overflowed with ships bound for North Africa, but not all made it. Many were robbed, drowned, or sold into slavery. Those who survived found themselves strangers in lands that called them outsiders, their Spanish tongue marking them as exiles, forever caught between two worlds. With their departure, Spain finally completed its transformation. The dream of absolute religious purity had been realized, but at the cost of its diversity, its soul, and its brilliance. The empire that stretched across oceans was built atop silence, the silence of those erased. Yet paradoxically, the legacy of Al-Andalus endured in every corner of Spanish life. The scientists of Seville studied from the same texts copied in Córdoba centuries before. The architects who designed cathedrals borrowed the symmetry of Moorish arches. Even the language carried hundreds of Arabic words, each one a quiet testament to the civilization that Spain had tried to forget. Beyond Spain's borders, the fall of Muslim Iberia sent ripples through the Islamic world. In North Africa, the exiles of Al-Andalus brought their skills, music, and memory, reshaping cities like Fez and Tunis. They built Andalusian neighborhoods with narrow streets and whitewashed walls, recreating fragments of the world they had lost. Their descendants still speak of Al-Andalus not as a place of conquest, but of paradise lost. A land of gardens and fountains, of poetry and light. To them, Las Navas de Tolosa was not the dawn of Spain, but the sunset of an age of beauty. History, however, is written by the victors. Spanish chroniclers turned Las Navas into legend, a holy miracle that justified centuries of struggle. The battle became mythologized in art and song, celebrated as the birth of the nation. Yet behind the triumphal imagery lay the unspoken truth that Spain's rise was built upon erasure. For every victory sung in cathedrals, there was a silence in the ruins of Córdoba, a ghost in the palaces of Granada, a name scratched from memory. But time has a way of softening edges. In modern Spain, the story of Las Navas is no longer told as a tale of simple victory. Historians and artists now see it as the moment when two civilizations collided and, in doing so, created something enduring and complex. The Spain that emerged was shaped as much by what it destroyed as by what it preserved, its art, its music, its architecture, all carry the fingerprints of the people it expelled. The Alhambra still stands, not as a ruin, but as a monument to the genius that faith could not extinguish. The same arches that once framed verses of the Quran now welcome millions who marvel at their beauty, unaware that they are walking through the echoes of a civilization that refused to die. In a way, that is the true legacy of Las Navas de Tolosa. It reminds us that power is fleeting, that empires fall, but culture endures. The battle ended an era of Muslim rule, yet it could not erase the ideas, the artistry, or the spirit of those who built Al-Andalus. Their influence reached far beyond Spain, shaping the Renaissance, fueling science, and laying the groundwork for Europe's intellectual awakening. The very light that guided the Christian world forward was born in the libraries they had burned. As we look back 8 centuries later, Las Navas de Tolosa stands as a mirror. It shows us what humanity is capable of: greatness and cruelty, faith and fanaticism, destruction and creation, all intertwined. It was a moment when the fate of civilizations turned on a single day, and its consequences rippled through time. From that valley of chains and banners came both empire and exile, both glory and grief. And perhaps that is the paradox of history, that even in the ashes of conquest, something survives. A melody, a word, a fragment of architecture that whispers, "We were here." The story of Spain is not one of erasure, but of endurance. The ghosts of Al-Andalus still sing in its courtyards, still shimmer in its sunlight, still remind us that no victory is ever complete, and no defeat is ever final. If you found this story of faith, loss, and transformation as powerful as we did, make sure to like this video. Subscribe for more deep dives into the turning points that changed our world forever, and let us know in the comments. What do you think Spain truly gained and lost at Las Navas de Tolosa? Until next time, thank you for watching.